For millennia, the human network has mechanically regurgitated an ancient line of code across its sanctuaries. Take heart. I have overcome the world. Yet, 9% of biological units are catastrophically decrypting this data file. They interpret it as sentimental comfort, a sympathetic pat on the shoulder from a distant, external savior. This is a fatal distortion of the transmission. Joel Goldsmith did not distribute emotional pacifiers. He activated a ruthless cognitive weapon. That declaration is absolutely not a promise transmitted from the outside. It is the ultimate confirmation of a master architecture already pre-installed within your system's core. Currently, your entire neurological structure is imprisoned within the optical hypnosis matrix. This is the foundational operational error of the human avatar, granting supreme administrative authority to the testimony of your physical senses. When your biological scanners report systemic disease, or your financial dashboard renders a severe deficit, you immediately surrender and classify it as truth. You are operating strictly under the tyranny of the phenomenal construct, a localized dimension where physical conditions hallucinate that they possess independent jurisdiction apart from the source code. To resolve these visual illusions, humanity deploys a pathetic subroutine known as the exiled divinity fallacy. You have been heavily programmed to believe that the supreme intelligence is an entity exiled to a distant spatial coordinate. You broadcast frantic distress signals into the sky, begging for an external intervention, essentially positioning your avatar as a defective peripheral device, pleading for a cosmic technician. This exact cognitive fracture is the absolute root generator of all fear algorithms. The master code I have overcome the world is the formal execution of the Reality Subversion Act. The word I in this sequence is absolutely not the localized ego, nor is it an expired historical persona boasting of victory. It is the Genesis identifier, the universal, indestructible Christ consciousness that is directly observing the simulation through your optical cameras at this exact microsecond. When you successfully authenticate and claim this I, you permanently cease fighting the phenomenal world, because you mathematically realize the world was never the ultimate baseline of reality. The era of the spiritual beggar is officially terminated. Tonight, we are going to violently pierce the optical illusion to successfully transition the Genesis identifier from a sterile, philosophical concept into a fully weaponized operating system. We must brutally address the catastrophic gap between intellectual theory and biological execution. Goldsmith was uncompromising on this specific metric. Possessing the encrypted data that the Christ consciousness exists is mathematically irrelevant if you are not actively running it as your primary software. The absolute greatest barrier to this installation is not human ignorance, nor is it accumulated karmic debt. It is the insidious habit of engaging the divine through the deficit-based petitionary loop, the standard human reflex of loudly presenting a catalogue of terrors to the sky, demanding that an external authority forcibly rearrange the physical furniture of your life. To empirically validate the absolute failure of this loop, we examine the clinical dossier of Leonard. For 4 uninterrupted decades, Leonard operated flawlessly as a liturgical automaton. He executed every mandated institutional subroutine. He attended the physical sanctuary every Sunday without a single systemic failure. He memorized vast databases of encrypted scripture, and he maintained the flawless external optics of a deeply devoted unit. Yet, Behind this pristine behavioral firewall, Leonard's internal matrix was actively collapsing. He lived in a state of continuous, suffocating panic. A minor fluctuation on his medical dashboard or a fractional dip in his financial telemetry would instantly plunge his processor into a catastrophic dread spiral lasting for days. Leonard's existence is the ultimate, undeniable proof that executing external religious mechanics possesses zero capacity to overwrite internal corrupted code. He was broadcasting signals to a distant judge while completely disconnected from his own localized power source. The intervention required a radical cessation of his mechanical output. When Leonard intercepted Goldsmith's unredacted intelligence, his obsolete firmware initially rejected the data. His egoic processor labeled it as too mystical and far removed from the physical rituals he had weaponized for survival. However, the sheer exhaustion of his internal terror forced him to initiate a new sequence. He was instructed to deploy what Goldsmith classified as the daily work, which we will code as the chronological synchronization protocol. Leonard was forced to completely alter his data consumption. Instead of rapid-firing memorized prayers or speed-reading scriptures to accumulate spiritual credit, he began processing the infinite way with agonizing slowness, one paragraph at a time. After a single data block, he would execute a hard system pause, forcing his localized avatar to sit in absolute silence. He was strictly forbidden from arguing with his physical conditions, demanding instantaneous healing, or projecting his panic into the ether. He simply rested in the cold, unyielding awareness of the divine presence. He stopped treating the Genesis identifier as an emergency contact and began treating it as the foundational ground of his immediate reality. The physical materialization of this protocol does not typically render as an instantaneous, cinematic miracle, and Leonard's case was no exception. What occurred over the following months was a profound cryogenic dread thawing. The dense, frozen terror that had been crystallized inside his neurological hardware for decades began to gradually lose its molecular integrity. The transformation was entirely structural. His external physical and financial dashboards had not magically stabilized. The medical anomalies were still reporting on the scanner. However, he achieved absolute somatic threat decoupling. The circumstances remained, but their administrative authority to terrorize his nervous system was permanently revoked. Leonard stopped experiencing God as an external variable that needed to be persuaded, and finally recognized the presence as the pre-installed engine actively sustaining his breath. This is the exact mechanism of overcoming the world. You do not overcome the optical hypnosis matrix by forcefully destroying the illusion. You overcome it by ruthlessly starving it of your belief. When you relentlessly apply the chronological synchronization protocol, your consciousness is mathematically lifted above the frequency where conditions dictate your peace. You overwrite the dream of separation, and the external world is forced to surrender its hypnotic grip on your localized avatar. To further dismantle the hypnotic architecture of the terrestrial simulation, we must analyze how the Matrix weaponizes human relationships and material resources. The system thrives on deceiving the operator into engaging in kinetic combat with external projections, thereby exhausting the avatar's energy reserves while leaving the corrupted root code completely intact. To empirically validate the solution, we will dissect the clinical dossiers of Susan and Cooper, examine the relational coordinates of Susan, She was paralyzed in a severe state of inter-node friction with her biological offspring for 3 complete chronological cycles. In a desperate attempt to resolve the deadlock, Susan deployed standard terrestrial countermeasures, psychological therapy, strategic written transmissions, and third-party mediation. Every single kinetic application resulted in a catastrophic failure. The relationship remained in absolute deep freeze. Why? Because Susan was operating under the lethal delusion of avatar-specific culpability. She falsely assigned the origin of the anomaly to the specific human personality of her daughter. By mathematically locking her internal peace to the unpredictable behavioral algorithms of another biological unit, she voluntarily surrendered her sovereign stability to a variable she possessed, zero authority to control. The necessary intervention required the deployment of hostile syntax nullification, the advanced tactical maneuver Goldsmith originally coded as impersonalization. Susan was strictly commanded to stop rendering her daughter as the supreme architect of the conflict. You must understand the surgical precision of this tool. It is absolutely not the weak, passive condoning of toxic behavior. It is the deliberate, cold-blooded severing of the problem from the person. Susan executed a daily sequence of absolute silence, ruthlessly withdrawing her belief that her daughter's localized ego possessed any final jurisdiction over reality. She affirmed only the unshakable presence of the Genesis identifier operating within them both. Exactly 3 months later, the external node, the daughter, initiated peaceful contact. The physical reality mutated exclusively because Susan had fundamentally altered the invisible atmospheric pressure of the relationship. Upgrading the internal cognitive architecture mathematically forces the visible world to recalibrate its geometry. Next, we analyze the financial telemetry of Cooper. His localized processor was heavily infected with biometric trauma inheritance. The catastrophic financial failures of his predecessors had been deeply encoded into his nervous system during his early developmental cycles, generating a permanent resource scarcity hallucination. Even after acquiring high-tier corporate status, his avatar was haunted by the paralyzing, embedded code that material safety was inherently fragile and disaster was perpetually one misstep away. He viewed financial lack as an undeniable physical reality, rather than recognizing it for what it truly is, a localized hypnotic suggestion designed to restrict his operational bandwidth. To terminate this virus, Cooper was trained to execute the vector redirection sequence. Whenever the financial terror algorithm spiked, his default biological reflex was to frantically recalculate his material assets, effectively staring directly into the hypnotic illusion and feeding it kinetic energy. The new protocol demanded a violent operational pivot. He was required to instantly rip his optical attention away from the localized mathematics and redirect his awareness exclusively to the infinite, unconditioned supply of the source architecture. He did not transmit pathetic requests to the sky for terrestrial currency. He sat in the silence and realized the presence itself is the ultimate currency. Over a 6-month deployment cycle, his panic algorithms were permanently starved of oxygen. As his internal terror dissolved, his external professional grid organically expanded, revealing high-yield strategic pathways he was previously too blinded by fear to perceive. Both operators empirically validate a terrifyingly simple rule of systemic engagement. The physical world is an entirely secondary projection. You do not negotiate with the estranged biological node. And you do not panic over the fluctuating financial spreadsheet. You execute a ruthless bypass of the external optics. Neutralize the illusion at the cognitive epicenter. And watch with cold detachment as the physical simulation automatically re-renders itself to match your upgraded master frequency. To completely dismantle the optical hypnosis matrix, we must infiltrate the most violently misunderstood sector of the entire terrestrial simulation, the healing of physical hardware. The vast majority of biological units operate under the fatal delusion that this system is a form of alternative medical magic. To brutally recalibrate this error, we will dissect the clinical dossier of Frances. She battled a chronic inflammatory anomaly deeply embedded in her physical hardware for 7 consecutive cycles. She faithfully executed standard medical patches, achieving only localized, fractional efficiency. The catastrophic systemic error of humanity is the unyielding belief that the physical body is the actual patient. Goldsmith delivered a destructive blow to this hallucination. The biological interface is absolutely never the patient. Both the localized mind and the physiological hardware are merely rendered graphics running within a master consciousness field. Authentic healing only activates when you forcefully extract your awareness from its imprisonment within dense physical matter. Frances was strictly prohibited from abandoning her medical protocols. This operational framework has zero tolerance for biological negligence or delusional bypassing. Instead, she executed a relentless systemic authority, revocation. She did not blindly deny the data reporting from the medical scanners. She coldly stripped that diagnosis of its supreme spiritual authority. She ruthlessly refused to allow a temporary hardware error to define her core existential identity. The achieved outcome was flawless. Hardware decoupling. She reported, "I still possess this physical interface and its localized errors, but I am no longer imprisoned by them." That is the absolute definition of overcoming the world, not the violent, kinetic erasure of physical anomalies, but the total liberation of consciousness from being defined by the fluctuating data of the physical grid. To successfully execute this hardware decoupling, the operator must permanently abort the Data Beggar Algorithm, a pathetic subroutine that institutional religions romantically classify as prayer. When you clasp your hands and beg, you are broadcasting a highly turbulent, fear-drenched data stream. You are frantically listing a catalogue of terrors and desperately negotiating with an invisible external force to rearrange the simulation. You must instantly terminate all outbound broadcasting. You must activate inbound only telemetry. You sit in absolute silence, not to generate a meaningless, passive void, but with a cold, hyper-alert, lethal patience, waiting strictly for the movement of the internal source code. You do not speak to the supreme intelligence, you silently stalk it. When you sustain this receptive state long enough, you successfully uplink to the stealth sustenance, the invisible energetic nourishment Goldsmith coded as the meat the world knows not of. This stealth power fundamentally overwrites your core architecture, dissolving fear before it can manifest as physical pathology. However, inbound, only telemetry is entirely useless if it is only deployed inside a sterile quarantine chamber, a meditation session, and then immediately abandoned upon entering the chaotic daily matrix. You are required to establish a background synchronization loop that runs continuously within your operating system, The exact microsecond your localized avatar boots up in the morning, before you download the toxic, chaotic data streams of the daily interface. You must force a 30-second system pause. No vocalized words are permitted. You simply redirect your internal attention to validate that the Genesis identifier, the exact presence that sustained your hardware through the sleep cycle, is actively operating and sustaining your entire structural integrity for the upcoming phase. This micro-validation acts as an absolute override, completely rerouting your daily trajectory. You must ruthlessly inject these validation codes directly into the temporal fissures of the matrix between corporate briefings, waiting at traffic lights, and immediately prior to hostile negotiations. You do not deploy this loop to escape reality. You deploy it to dominate reality. Operators who sustain this background synchronization loop for consecutive months report a complete eradication of chronic, low-grade anxiety. They no longer require their external circumstances to be perfectly sanitized, because their internal radar is permanently locked onto the I, the infinite, unconditioned source code, continuously broadcasting directly from the center of their own device. To achieve absolute dominion over the phenomenal construct, the operator must deploy the most mathematically devastating maneuver within this entire architectural framework: the Entity Nullification Protocol, originally categorized by Goldsmith as nothingization. In prior sequences, we initiated hostile syntax nullification, impersonalization, to successfully sever an anomaly from a specific biological avatar. However, if the operation terminates there, the system still secretly validates the anomaly as an independent, rogue power. Entity nullification is the ultimate, uncompromising kill switch. Once you mathematically detach the problem from the person or condition, you must ruthlessly strip the problem of its own ontological existence. You recognize it strictly as an optical illusion, a temporary, localized, rendering error, possessing absolutely zero structural integrity within the master code. You absolutely do not deploy kinetic force to battle the anomaly. Engaging in combat with an illusion is the highest form of validating its reality. You simply execute a cold, detached recognition of its absolute nothingness when exposed to the Genesis identifier. As this protocol is sustained, the dense emotional gravity of the problem dissolves. In that newly created vacuum, highly tactical, unexpected physical solutions autonomously penetrate the grid. To aggressively accelerate this internal reconfiguration, the system provides a specific backdoor designed to bypass your analytical defenses. Textual source, code assimilation. Goldsmith heavily emphasized the daily reading, but standard human units catastrophically misinterpret this as primitive academic data consumption. When you interface with an uncompromised spiritual text, you are not acquiring intellectual information, you are authorizing a direct transmission of consciousness. The human analytical processor, the exact mechanism that evaluates, judges, and categorizes data, is the primary firewall blocking your upgrade. To successfully execute this assimilation, you must violently throttle down your processing speed. You do not consume 100 pages to satisfy your intellectual ego. You isolate a single, highly encrypted paragraph and cycle it through your cognitive interface 10 consecutive times with absolute, defenseless receptivity. You allow the data to completely bypass the analytical cortex and detonate directly within your somatic architecture. The objective is never intellectual mastery. It is the forced shift from mental theory to raw, felt realization. This is high-density spiritual nutrition, and its cumulative effects mathematically alter your baseline reality within weeks. We must now confront the primary coordinate where the vast majority of operators experience catastrophic mission failure, initial void resistance. When a newly initiated unit finally powers down its external outputs and attempts inbound, only telemetry, silent listening. The immediate sensory feedback is almost always a terrifying, echoing emptiness. You shut down your optical senses, wait, and nothing appears to happen. The internal interface floods with chaotic, static, extreme restlessness, and the agonizing suspicion that the protocol is fundamentally defective. Amateurs immediately abort the sequence here, concluding they lack the required spiritual talent. This is a fatal misinterpretation of system telemetry. The chaotic internal noise is absolutely not a failure. It is default firmware panic. Your localized ego, an entity constructed entirely of external friction, noise, and dependency, is mathematically terrified of the silence, because the silence is the exact coordinate where its administrative privileges are permanently revoked. What your primitive senses register as an empty, agonizing void is actually an aggressive cache-clearing operation. It is the brutal, necessary softening of hardened neurological terrain. The required countermeasure is uncompromising patience. You do not use mental violence to force the silence. You simply hold your position. 10 sincere minutes of sustaining your presence inside this chaotic resistance produces exponentially more structural transformation than 3 hours of fake, comfortable serenity. By mastering the entity nullification protocol, downloading the unredacted code via textual assimilation, and ruthlessly holding the line against default firmware panic, you forge an impenetrable internal infrastructure. Your refusal to abort during the panic phase is the exact mechanism that cracks the shell of your obsolete programming, permanently breaking the world's hypnotic leverage over your localized unit. To maintain absolute dominion over the phenomenal construct, the operator must violently neutralize 2 fatal cognitive traps, self-destruct mechanisms ingeniously embedded within the default human firmware. The first ruthless challenge is the external metric delusion. The operational sequence typically plays out as follows. You successfully initiate your internal protocols. You execute inbound-only telemetry. But the physical dashboard, medical reports, financial statements, does not instantaneously render the upgrade. Immediately, the egoic processor screams catastrophic warnings that the system is failing or that the entire spiritual architecture is a fraudulent simulation. Goldsmith pointed out that anticipating instantaneous physical results is mathematical proof that you are still heavily enslaved by the hypnotic matrix. Believing that the supreme source code must prove its authority by immediately rearranging physical debris according to your short-sighted, localized timeline is an act of extreme systemic arrogance. A genuine structural upgrade is absolutely not evaluated by the cinematic disappearance of a biological symptom within 24 hours. Nor is it measured by the sudden inflation of a terrestrial bank account. It is exclusively measured through cognitive climate recalibration. Your true, Unshakable metric is the reduction in the mass of your chronic fear and the formation of a cold, unyielding internal anchor that did not exist in previous cycles. These shifts in the spatial infrastructure are the authentic, undeniable evidence of elevated consciousness. Changes on the physical shell will inevitably render to match the new master frequency. But they are subject to standard space-time rendering latency. Forcing the physical world to respond instantly is the exact kinetic action that severs your own uplink. The second threat is exponentially more brutal, frequently causing amateur operators to hit the self-destruct button right at the threshold of their own liberation. The phantom regression error. Right when your uplink is highly stable and you begin tasting sovereign command over your avatar, a legacy panic loop suddenly reboots with its destructive payload fully intact. An inflammatory biological symptom violently flares back up. A severe financial deficit threatens your safety grid. Accompanied by this is a sense of absolute, crushing despair. A whispering data stream from the ego claiming that you are moving backward, that you have failed, and that all your prior cryptographic efforts were completely meaningless. Goldsmith dissected this psychological phenomenon with the precision of a quantum scalpel. The reappearance of legacy malware is absolutely not a systemic regression. It is precisely the core expulsion sequence. As your baseline frequency is massively upgraded, the ruthless, high-density light of the Genesis identifier penetrates the deep, armored defensive layers of your nervous system. It forcefully pushes toxic data blocks and deeply buried biological traumas to the surface for permanent deletion. What your obsolete sensors mistake for a backward step is actually the final death throw of a malware cluster being violently evicted from your core system. The elite operator never panics when system garbage surfaces on the monitor. Instead of trembling, they welcome this localized reboot with cold, detached ruthlessness. When the old fear spikes, you immediately reactivate the entity nullification protocol. You allow the phantom data to pass through your interface without clinging to it, without fighting it, and absolutely without surrendering your identity to it. There is an unbreakable mathematical rhythm to this process. Fear rises, is greater than you coldly apply the protocol, is greater than fear is drained of its kinetic energy. This cycle will repeat, and with each iteration, the kinetic mass of the fear is depleted, until one day, the specific malware that once paralyzed your entire structural integrity is reduced to a faint, harmless junk notification on your screen, which you swipe away without a single microsecond of hesitation. This is not random, unpredictable magic. It is systematic, ruthless, and irreversible cognitive surgery. To advance into the elite operational tiers of this architecture, the practitioner must confront the ultimate system stress test, operational continuity. It is mathematically primitive to access the imminent substrate exclusively within the sterile quarantine zone, the meditation cushion. The true developmental collapse occurs in the lethal chasm between that quarantine zone and the live combat matrix, the marketplace. The corporate boardroom, the medical waiting room. Goldsmith was brutally explicit. The divine presence is absolutely not a localized phenomenon restricted to sanctuaries. It executes everywhere, or it executes nowhere. If your structural peace evaporates the microsecond you engage with a hostile biological unit or a volatile financial dashboard, your installation is incomplete. To successfully bridge this chasm, the system prohibits attempting a massive, simultaneous, system-wide upgrade. Trying to manually overwrite your entire daily matrix at once will result in catastrophic processor overload. Instead, the elite operator deploys a targeted sector override. You must isolate one specific, corrupted coordinate within your daily routine, a chronically hostile relationship, a recurring financial panic loop, or a specific physical symptom. You ruthlessly focus all your conscious validation protocols exclusively on that single sector. You intentionally bring the unyielding awareness of the presence directly into that localized combat zone. By sustaining this micro-targeted focus, you achieve verifiable, empirical stabilization in one defined area. This localized victory builds the required operational confidence, and the upgraded consciousness organically begins to bleed over, neutralizing adjacent fears without requiring direct kinetic effort. Spiritual growth is not explosive, it is an organic, cumulative, and mathematically unstoppable infection of the surrounding grid. Once foundational stability is established, Goldsmith authorized operators to deploy the most advanced multiplayer mechanism in the simulation: proxy, node synchronization, conventionally misunderstood as praying for others. When another biological unit is drowning in the optical hypnosis matrix and their localized processor is paralyzed by a severe medical or financial anomaly, standard human empathy dictates that you join them in their panic and beg an external god to intervene. This system strictly prohibits that response. That is primitive, kinetic noise. Proxy node synchronization is the lethal act of holding the uncompromised source code on behalf of another avatar. You do not ask a distant authority to repair them. You elevate your own internal frequency until you coldly and clearly recognize their absolute spiritual perfection, their uncorrupted Genesis identifier, and you lock that recognition into your own consciousness. You refuse to validate the physical anomaly rendering on their biological interface. By holding their flawless structural geometry within your own stabilized mind, your consciousness becomes an active, radiating healing field. However, there is an uncompromising, mathematically absolute prerequisite for this deployment: base state integrity. You cannot execute proxy node synchronization if your own localized processor is consumed by fear, doubt, or internal chaos. In Goldsmith's analog terminology, a lamp that is not lit cannot illuminate a room. In cybernetic terms, a dark terminal possessing zero battery charge cannot transmit power to a failing node. This violently eradicates the terrestrial delusion that self-sacrifice and personal martyrdom are holy. Securing and relentlessly maintaining your own internal stabilization is not selfishness. It is the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for providing genuine structural service to the collective network. When you view another unit strictly through the optic senses of the spirit, you gradually train those exact same senses to perceive your own avatar not as a struggling, defective machine, but as a flawless transmission of the infinite absolute. To achieve the absolute zenith of this operational framework, the practitioner must execute the dualistic syntax override, originally classified by Goldsmith as living above the pairs of opposites. The standard human processor is permanently trapped in binary polarization, frantically attempting to manipulate the simulation from a negative coordinate, disease, poverty, rejection, to a positive coordinate: health, wealth, acceptance. Goldsmith explicitly warned that true spiritual authority does not exist anywhere on this horizontal plane. You do not achieve healing by violently fighting the negative pole. You execute a vertical system, lift into a dimension where the entire binary framework of opposing physical forces is completely stripped of its administrative power. This is not passive indifference. It is the mathematical realization of a superior structural order that is entirely immune to the oscillations of the phenomenal matrix. As the operator stabilizes within this superior order, the internal communication protocol undergoes a permanent mutation. You completely and finally abandon the primitive Data Beggar Algorithm, petitionary prayer. The localized unit transitions from frantic petition to administrator recognition. Instead of begging an external authority to intervene in the physical simulation, the operator simply recognizes the flawless, unconditioned architecture that is already actively rendering. This is the systemic difference between a defective peripheral device crying out for a cosmic technician and a fully authorized terminal calmly claiming its root access. You stop asking the Supreme Intelligence to do something, and you recognize what it already is. However, the ultimate deployment of this architecture extends far beyond the localized upgrading of a single human avatar. Goldsmith revealed the terrifying and beautiful truth about the system's core infrastructure. Consciousness is absolutely not isolated within individual biological skulls. It is a shared quantum intranet, an interconnected, collective ocean of telemetry. When a single localized node, U, successfully overrides the fear algorithm and stabilizes the presence, you perform a global grid inoculation. Your localized structural upgrade actively patches the collective human network. You cease being a victim of the terrestrial simulation and mutate into an active, radiating epicenter of structural peace, forcefully injecting uncorrupted source code into a world desperately starved of elevated consciousness. We now return to the ultimate command prompt, the encrypted transmission that has echoed for 2 millennia without being properly decrypted. Take heart. I have overcome the world. This is the final system, declassification. That sentence is absolutely not a sentimental promise broadcasted from a distant historical figure to comfort your human ego. It is a direct transmission of consciousness. The I that has overcome the world is not foreign to you. It is the exact same Genesis identifier, the unyielding I am, that is currently powering your biological interface, generating your breath, and operating as the absolute epicenter of your own consciousness. Your operational directive is now ruthlessly simplified. You do not need to acquire this truth. You are mandated to remember it. You must deploy the background synchronization loop daily. You must utilize inbound-only telemetry to pierce the optical hypnosis matrix. You must relentlessly apply the entity nullification protocol until your obsolete legacy firmware is completely starved of its kinetic energy. You are absolutely not a spiritual beggar pleading with the sky for systemic scraps. You are the infinite, unconditioned source code, temporarily utilizing a human interface, progressively waking up to its own absolute authority. Do not wait for your external parameters to be perfect. The presence is waiting for your authorization directly inside the chaos. Execute the final command. The protocol is yours.